Okay, I think we're ready to get started. The Green Shirt Mafia has instructed me to tell you to turn your cell phones off. You like that? Yeah. So silence them or turn them off, please. This is the Comedy and Games panel. I am John Tatey. I handle the game section for the AV Club, the entertainment section of The Onion. And I'll let the panelists introduce themselves. Go ahead, Rihanna.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting that.
Oh, you go first.
No, you're sitting on the end.
Oh, is that?
Yeah.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Rihanna Pratchett. I'm a games writer, narrative designer. Worked on the Overlord franchise, which is now about 4.5 games strong. Whole other stuff: Heavenly Sword, Mirror's Edge, Viking Battle for Asgard, and other bits and pieces. So yeah, that's me.
Hi, I'm Tim. I'm the.
You can each have one. It's
no, this is the best one. Well, that's yours.
You guys are just going to Sonny and
It's
Cher
like taking
over there?
water at a restaurant. Yeah, we're going to sing Sonny and Cher songs later.
We worked out this shtick ahead of time, so I hope you're enjoying
Yeah,
it.
it played really well, actually.
Thanks for blowing my intro. I'm the founder of Double Fine Productions. We made Brutal Legends and Psychonauts and a whole bunch of Go out and buy it right now. Still available for $2 on Steam. So if you want to. And worked at LucasArts before that, working on a lot of graphic adventures like Grim Fandango and Full Throttle and Day of the Tentacle and Secret Monkey Island. So those games, yes.
I'm a big fan of those games. They're all very good. I'm Sean Banneman. I'm a writer and designer at Telltale. Most recently working on Tales of Monkey Island. Hey, thank you. I got a woo. Thank you. And Wallace and Gromit's Grand Adventures, and that's it thus far. So.
Well, when I was telling people that I was doing a comedy and games panel, people kind of looked at me like I was a sick puppy because they weren't even sure that such a thing existed. But I think that these three people, the work of these three people here proves that it does. But, people always said to me, like, there's action games and there's horror games, and a lot of genres have made the jump from film, but there's not really a comedy games genre. I'm not sure if that's a problem, but, it is a thing at least. Why do you think that there's really no, nut of comedy games?
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Going to be easy. I don't think comedy games is a genre, or should be a genre. I think comedy is just a very important tool in writing. I think if we look at the Monkey Island games and Psychonauts and all the things that are known for their humour, they're also great adventure games as well. And I don't think comedy games should be a genre, and we shouldn't think of it like that. Comedy is a very important tool, and it can be used across genres. So I'd say no to comedy game genres.
It's invalidated my whole
Sorry.
genre. Yeah, I think it's useful to have a genre in that sometimes you feel like watching a comedy movie, in some ways that it's going to be funny. And I think I sometimes I cynically think that the games business is like any other business, is very imitative, and if there was just a huge blockbuster game that was known as a comedy, then all of a sudden there'd be tons and tons and tons of them, and it's like no one sits down and beating and is saying like, well, how can we mitigate risk on this new title that we're spending millions of dollars on? And someone's like, well, let's make a comedy game because those are always huge, So there's some business reasons for it, and I don't know, I'm used to coming from a background at LucasArts. A lot of the way it used to work back in the kind of Wild West days is that you would kind of just say. Even management would be like, Ron, what game are you going to do next? And he'd be like, well, I'll tell you when it's done, So it was more just games, the management took bets on people instead of ideas. It wasn't like someone had an idea, like, let's make a comedy game. It was more just like, okay, we trust you with the game you're going to come up with, and it just happened to be funny people who were given those chances, and so the games turned out to be funny. So I don't know if that's the way things work. It's harder to find, I guess, examples of places where people are given that kind of leeway, I guess. It's a lot more about mitigating risk.
And also just, making a game with a funny premise that's about something and then having the comedy be in there. I think if you set out to make a comedy game, you're just going to keep telling fart jokes or you keep going to go to the same comedy well, where you should really be trying to tell a story about something and then weave the comedy in as, naturally as it sees fit, because it has to be honest. Like if you try to just like, oh, we're going to be funny, it's going to come across as insincere. So
Unless you're funny.
that's true.
But don't you feel like there are movies that do that declare like we're going to be funny, and then they
Yeah,
turn
but
out
there's
to
a lot
be
of
funny.
bad movies too. I think I just don't know if it's like, I don't sit down with that intent. I mean, we know we have to be funny, but it comes out, I guess. I just think, I don't know, I like I'm jumping on the Rihanna bandwagon of comedy as tool, I think.
Well, let's talk about that. This idea you're bringing up of the premise. How much of the humor in a game has to come from just the base premise of the gameplay?
I think it's vitally important. I think that's the entire structure. I think comedy games go bad when it's just about the writing. I mean, I think all the games that we've worked on that have been considered kind of comedy or amusing or whatever, they all had funny gameplay. And so it started at the core with Overlord. You're a kind of Sauron-type overlord running around the countryside with a big helmet and sword and an army of little gremlin-type minions that you kind of directed around. They looted and pillaged and set people on fire and stuff. And they had little animations, and they put lots of things on the head. Putting lots of things on the head was a big part of the comedy in Overlord, and it was took some of the pressure off to know that anything I write could never be as funny as a kind of amusing hat.
Was that okay? Side question, a follow up. Was that? Do they come to you and say like, this game's got to be really funny, or was it already funny, or was it like, I can't write anything but funny stuff because this guy's throwing these evil minions through crates and stuff? Like they can't be crying while it happens, or else it'll be a really sad game.
I think they kind of had a vague idea of where they wanted the tone to go, and it was just about finding someone that hit that and could kind of explore all the bits of the world. And I've kind of grown up with fantasy and going to science fiction conventions from the age of about 8 to 16. And so I have a lot of residual built-up annoyance with the wet side of fantasy, which really came through in the Overlord game. So that's why elves and unicorns really get a bad rep. But I think that helped play a part as well, definitely.
Awesome. Sorry, I asked a question. No, I don't.
No,
And
I love
back
it.
to you.
I love it. You're freelancing. Yeah. Sean, what you I know we talked about this yesterday. How much of a role does the premise of the story play, and how much of a role does sort of the kinetics of the gameplay factor into it for you? Because I know you work on these sort of adventure games that really aren't it's not really a lot of jumping and running and all that.
Yeah, I mean, I get into a lot of talks with, we'll play like Super Smash Brothers and laugh the whole time because people are getting, hitting funny places, I guess, and it's more of an emergent comedy. But I mean, you can tell if you guys are play Scum Adventure games or any of the Telltale games, like the sheer mechanics of walking a person around it and character interactions and finding objects and solving problems isn't, that's not where our humor comes from. But I think it's just a very different way of being funny. It kind of puts the onus on the script and on kind of the nuances of the characters and the creative choices, and heavily on the art team. Yeah, does that answer your question, I guess? And I think, so for us, it's really if we don't have a strong funny premise, if we don't have, this is the funny setup, this is what Guybrush is going to be doing, it's going to be hilarious because he's going to pretend this woman is his wife for a while, then yeah, we don't have that. We can't really fall back on the emergence. So that's incredibly important for us.
When I got here, Tim was already here, and the first thing he said to me was that comedy is all about timing, and that he got here first, so that I was a real asshole. But
it was hilarious if you were there.
But comedy does depend so much on timing, and sort of the thing is in games that timing is one of the most precious things that a player values for themselves to have control over. So, how do you manage that? How do you create a comic moment in the midst of gameplay? Anybody can. It doesn't always have to be on you, Rihanna.
There are other things that can come to your rescue. I mean, I think context is a big thing that we do have at our disposal. Timing, you can kind of do it certainly in cutscenes, although that's hardly interactive. If you have to have very tight control of the kind of gameplay and moment-to-moment mechanics to try and get that timing. It is possible, but it's very hard. That's why I think context and premise is so important. And certainly for the Overlord games, we focus on the context a lot. Sometimes working on things like pacing and sequence, timing is always really hard, especially in games. But there are other things you can fall back on. Animation, for example, was so important in Overlord. All the little minion animations, and that created a lot of emergent humor as well.
And people talk about how the player is controlling so much in the game. How can you have comedy because of the. But I guess we always try to think of these models for what are in adventure games in particular. Like, is it like a movie or is it like a game? But what kind of So we had this example once of it's kind of like you're writing a play where the main actor in the play is someone from the audience who's come up and they're improvising all their lines, and everybody in the rest of the cast has to kind of improvise around them and make the play consistent and still kind of move the story forward. And so you're like writing, in some ways, AI or just some simple scripts for people to try and deal with this crazy, drunk on-stage actor who's not, obeying any of your rules. But it's kind of a fun challenge to kind of like try and deal with them and still react in a funny way to everything, anticipate everything that you can think of them trying to do. And that's usually like the special part of, I guess, adventure games goes, how many of those things can you anticipate? Like, because there'll be just maybe one player in the entire world who does this weird combination of things. And if you do anticipate that maybe that one player will feel very special. But it seems like that everyone will find something like that in the game.
Yeah, I mean, you have a lot of power in cutscenes to be funny, but I think the best moments are when somebody has done one thing, like the A plus B equaling a joke. So a player has done one thing, they go talk to another person, and the context of their previous interaction is kind of tinting that interaction. I would love to have a great example off the top of my head right now, but and just giving the player, I think actually, I always look back at Secret of Monkey Island when I'm doing the Telltale stuff because that game is so good at giving you so many great things to say at a very high frequency rate. So you just kind of felt like you were the funniest guy in the room. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really important. And if you can do that in a game, that's awesome.
And like in unexpected ways, like in Metal Gear Solid, I heard a friend of mine was using the point of view camera in that to check out their the female character that was alongside of them. And if you do it for long enough, I don't know if you guys have experienced this. Like this friend of mine did, you look long enough, she talks to you like, "What are you looking at?" Like, and it's just it's a real funny moment because it just waits just enough time so it's obvious that you're doing something kind of creepy. But it was totally player instinct. Like the player did it, and like so you're busted. You're like busted in this comedy moment. It's great. I hear.
Well, it's not just about the player control either. I mean, like Tim, you're pretty much running your own show, and Sean, you kind of referred to yourself as a worker bee over at Telltale, very proudly, but Rhianna, you're more of a freelancer, so you don't have much, as much direct control. Is that frustrating? Is there some sort of process of translation that your stuff has to go through?
It can be very frustrating, and this is the reason why I had these badges made, just for a bit of fun. One of them says Story Robot, and if there's writers in the audience, you'll kind of understand this. This is usually when companies come to you and they just kind of rattle off. They don't have the story, but they know it's going to be 10,000 lines long, and they're going to need this and that, and they know nothing about it, but they know what they're going to need. That's my little Story Robot. And I've also got a narrative paramedic, which I'm sure there's even more writers that understand, and that's kind of when you're brought in about somewhere between 6 to 3 months before the game ships. And it's also what I call Weekend at Bernie's narrative. And that's when the story is so dead that all you can do is kind of put makeup on it and jiggle it around a bit and make it look alive. I think there's probably a lot of us that have been there. So this is my kind of gently mocking the industry via the medium of pin badges. It's getting a little better, I think. I started in the industry about 12 years ago as a journalist. So I've kind of jumped the side of the fence. And I feel a bit guilty, actually, about my time as a journalist because I think I maybe didn't realize how much work had gone into writing the stories and how much blood, sweat and tears was behind them, because it really is very hard to get kind of any kind of story in a game, let alone kind of one that makes people laugh or makes them cry or whatever. Certainly with the Overlord games, it was a lot easier than it normally is, and it was a small team. They were based in Holland. They were Dutch, so they're very kind of laid back. And they just kind of let me get on with things, and they didn't interfere too much, and there was less levels of people to get in my way. They let me do the audio directing and the casting and keep hold of the strings, which I think is so important and probably a little bit easier for someone like Tim to do. If you're kind of out of the loop, and sometimes that developers can sort of deliberately put you in a writer box, then it can be very difficult to find out what's going on. But certainly with the Overlord games, and I think that's probably why the humour in them became so ingrained, is because I worked very closely with the level designers on a sort of day-to-day basis, and we iterated every level of the game until we kind of got it right, until it was working for story and gameplay. So it really depends on the team, I think, and sometimes the smaller teams are better because there's a lot more trust there and there's less levels of people. Other than that, it's kind of been a little bit sort of hit and miss. Sometimes you have to kind of fight your way in. Sometimes you're out in the writer box. It's definitely like a kind of hired gun. You're sort of dropped into a battlefield and you've got to kind of assess what your tactics are, what the weapons are at your disposal, and kind of get bloody, basically.
How do you create this, a sense of humor on a development team? Like, is it possible to have just one or two people, sort of handling the funny, or does it need to be something that pervades the whole team?
Clown suits. If everyone's wearing clown suits all day long, it's totally funny. All the time. Have you done that? You're saying like, no, don't try that. We tried that, and it's like, it'd get all sweaty. And I mean, we, it sounds really corny. Well, maybe I won't say it. Well, like at Lucas, there was this, some people would say you have to have fun to make fun. And now that I say it out loud, it sounds like such a catchphrase. But I mean, we really believed in that we would always, we were really into having fun on the development team. And the best, times I ever had were sitting in that room just brainstorming puzzles for Monkey Island. And we didn't have many rules about what we had to talk about. We just had to come up with 2 puzzles a day, and then we would just sit in there eating candy and making jokes. And it was really fun, and if the team is having that much fun, I think it's got to come out in the game somehow.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like, I mean, putting funny people in a room, and like you can just kind of tell when there's like, you can kind of see the love in the game, like the humor from that room. And we have that room at Telltale. Yeah, we just sit around and make horrible jokes, and then if we laugh at a joke on the first day, then we laugh at a joke on the second day. It's like, okay, that could be good enough to go in a game. And that's how we do it, And it's also just, the culture of funny is really important, because if you don't have that, you find yourself like fighting for the most bizarre shit ever, because you'll tell a joke, like, oh, there's going to be a look at when Guybrush goes into this room, him and a monkey are going to do a jig. And then if somebody doesn't think it's funny, like, you're the maniac fighting for Guybrush doing a jig with a monkey, and you quickly just feel insane, so the culture of like, yeah, let's do that is really important, because otherwise you just feel like you're having a fever dream, and you're just, it's funny, and you're doing this a lot.
Certainly from what I've done, that the funny, although I've kind of handled the funny, especially with the voice actors in particular on Overlord, that it was letting them play with the funny a little bit, and we had some fantastic voice actors with really great comic sensibilities and timing. And they brought so much to the game, I think, especially Mark Silk, who voices Gnarl, and a lot of other characters. We directed him mainly over Skype, actually, because he has his own studio, and that was a blast. And so many of our actors were great fun to work with. And it's giving actors a little bit of space to kind of play around the language and improvise a little bit. You always get these strange emergent things that I wish could have gone into the game, like. We have Mark singing in the voice of Gnarl along to I Don't Feel Like Dancing by the Scissor Sisters, which just kind of came out of a random line in the game. And because he's an ex-radio presenter, he happened to have the MP3 squirreled away on his desktop. And, yeah, that was definitely something I wish had gone in.
And, I mean, specifically for writing, I think I was thinking about, the atmosphere of creating, like Sean was saying, like a safe atmosphere to experiment and try stupid ideas. And a lot of that came by accident in the old days, because I told the story before, but like when we started on Monkey Island, I don't know about Dave, but I thought we were writing the temporary dialogue for that game, like, because we were really new, and there was a big company there with George Lucas and everyone, so, like, I'm sure they had professionals to come in and write the dialogue. So we were just kind of goofing around and writing really silly dialogue. And it took the pressure off us because we didn't sit there and worry about, like, is this good enough? We were just trying to make each other laugh in the office. And then as it went on, Ron was like, no, this is the dialogue for the game. And I'm like, oh, God. And so I never wrote anything funny after that. So just don't tell people their stuff is going to be used in the final product. Just tell it's all temporary. And but really, it's like, how do you create that kind of safe experience when you know that you're actually doing the final round? How do you make it? And the last example was we wrote as a joke, "Look behind you, a three-headed monkey," and it was like that. Okay, we're gonna definitely take that line out because there's no such thing as a three-headed monkey. Like that's stupid. And Ron was like, no, we should leave that in. And actually, we should actually get Art to make a three-headed monkey. And it went in. I was like, no, come on, let me take it out. It was dumb. And then I realized like that impulse, that fear of like that's too silly, that's too ridiculous. It's like the enemy of everything you do all day long. It's because you just want to censor yourself constantly, and then learning to kind of like not care at all about. Well, I mean, care very, very deeply, but not care about like if anyone's going to laugh at you or make fun of you for putting a three-headed monkey in.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we are able to do that just by at Telltale with the episodic model. I think we get a lot of that because I can just write a ridiculous thing and know that if it sucks and nobody laughs, well, like Stemley or Grossman or something, the next month is going to be funnier. So it's like I can just not freak out. And also the schedule, because everything's coming out every month. Like there are jokes in that game, I'm like, I didn't write that. Like that didn't come from me. And it was like, must have been just a 3 a.m. I was sitting on the couch thinking it was hilarious at the time. And there was one joke that I just hung around for a long time. Actually, there's a Double Fine joke in Lair of the Leviathan where they contemplate what exactly is a double fine. It's very, but like I would have taken that joke out in a sane mind if I had been lucid and
Me too.
But thank you. It's really good. You'll enjoy it. But yeah, I think it's like I can't. I'm not allowed to be insecure because of the time and because it's just every month we're trying to put something out. And therefore our team culture is like that too, where it's like, yeah, that's funny, don't overthink it.
Is it easier with, this sort of episodic model to sort of let loose because you just know you have to get it done and that there's, a next episode after that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just be frozen at a keyboard if it was like, if I was working on a $30 million game, oh my God, somebody's going to say this. That is terrifying, And then once you have this army of people, I mean, at Telltale the teams are, anytime between 15 and 25, depending. Like, when you're looking over somebody's shoulder and he's been there for 8 hours trying to build this scene that you've written, and somebody's animating, a facial tick, and somebody else is animating, or building a strange object that you think is important, you're quickly faced with the reality of the shit you wrote 2 nights before, like, oh my God, this poor guy, my friends are having to this, they're like, and if it's not funny, that's blood, sweat, and tears on their end, and you just feel terrible. So, sorry, this got really emotional, didn't it? I'm just gonna need a second.
It's like a war movie.
So yeah, the idea of that just being compounded, is terrifying. You have to, I guess, turn off every ounce of creative insecurity you have, which I'm going to do right now. So,
you guys mentioned Super Smash Brothers earlier, and I think that game and the new Super Mario Brothers game, they're sort of intentionally or not informed by this silent film era slapstick. And so I'm wondering what in either within the games world or outside of the games world, what informs your comic sensibility when you're putting together a script or a game?
Where are we stealing our ideas from specifically?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Oh, sorry, I thought you were taking the lead.
No, you're clearing your throat. I just wanted to make sure that everyone knew that you were talking about stealing ideas.
It's kind of really hard to say. I guess everywhere if I think too hard about where it's come from, maybe it will stop coming, and therefore it's probably a good idea not to. But as I mentioned earlier, I spent a lot of time at science fiction conventions, and I said residual anger to a certain amount of wet fantasy certainly helped with Overlord. And just kind of, certainly from my family, I developed a way of looking at the world, and a lot of kind of innate observational humour, which I think has helped. Also I'm British, and we do some of the best comedy in the world. And I think just growing up in Britain during the kind of the 80s, when it's kind of 80s and 90s heyday of kind of British comedy and British fantasy as well. Not fantasy in general, not British. I won't pretend we're any good at that really. So that definitely helped with Overlord. I mean, I grew up with sort of Princess Bride and a lot of Conan and Excalibur, and so that all combined created this kind of weird mix that's in my head.
Yeah, I mean, how do you explain, like, everything you take in your life somehow gets churned out and comes out in your writing? And so there are definitely things where I remember, like, milestones, and I remember during Monkey Island, Ron was like, The Simpsons had just come out, and he's like, Monkey Island's not funny enough. It's got to be funny like The Simpsons. It's like it's got to have one joke after another. And we're like, oh, God, it's hard. That's really hard. But I did watch, I still watch that show and shows like it sometimes in the middle of writing. I remember for Psychonauts, I'd watch it, and it's the only thing I could take a break for when I was in a big crunch for writing, because I did find the show very inspiring, because, except for season 10. But I mean, I really, no, I'm kidding. That's mean. Because sometimes, sometimes you can get lazy because, the standard for comedy in games is like, it's not set that, it's not, it sounds bad, but like sometimes you can write something like, well, you can get lazy about it until you see that, like in film and TV, the comedy writers are really, really, they get together in those bullpens and they try to just write stuff and then make it better and make it better and make it better. And when you see how much they care about making this stuff funny, you're like, well, I have to try at least that hard. So I guess just as far as the effort goes, I find that really inspiring.
So the key is to care that it's funny?
Or to be absolutely terrified that it's going to suck.
Yeah.
That's what I mean.
Fear is a giant motivator. Yeah, absolutely. Just blanket fear. The game comes out and nobody laughs, and God, I'm done being insecure, dude, right now. So, but I mean, what's funny is like, I grew up in a small town in Wyoming, which is very like England. Actually, it's very similar in comedic sensibilities. It's a hotbed for comedy. But so what I learned was funny was like me and my best friend like telling jokes to each other, and it becomes a very personal thing of what you think is funny. But yeah, I do the same thing when I'm writing. It's like I'll jump over and watch episodes of Arrested Development or 30 Rock for the newer stuff, and that's where that. And actually, I would watch because working on Tales of Monkey Island, I would watch YouTube playthroughs of like LeChuck's Revenge, and that helps. Just the music and stealing just rampantly from that. So it's pretty much a carbon copy now. So thank you, Tim.
Hey.
Much appreciated.
When you have these big games, you don't know whether a player is going to play your game for, an hour or 10 hours or 50 hours. And is there a difference between sort of the jokes or the comedy that you front load and the jokes that you put in there for the obsessive, completionist? And, what's the difference in the flavor there? Like, do you hide away little gems, your favorite gems deep in the game, or is this metaphor getting uncomfortable now?
My favorite gems? Well, they're all like my babies. And where do I hide my babies? No,
Come on.
So, I write the game linearly, so it depends on when I'm funny. Like, if I think I'm going to be funny and sit down, like, that helps. Like, there's a thing in Tales of Monkey Island episode 3 where this crazy, explorer is asking you to find 100,000 grubs so he can build this manatee cochlea. It makes sense in the game, I really promise. And you can do it. Like, if you just collect 100,000 of these things and give it to him, there's a joke. So we try not to do that, but you want to you got to keep people engaged, so like a fast feedback loop of funny is important. And then also, it's a balance. It's always a balance,
It does take some pressure off when you know the player's doing something silly on purpose, that you can kind of like, you have a little more leeway in the jokes you make with them.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, I think the original Monkey Island games, anyone who's played them and has kind of gone on to writing knows the importance of how much you look at the player trying to break the world and, you know, doing bad things over and over again or silly things and investigating corners. And, you know, putting great stuff in there is really important because you grab a player by the throat when you do that. And, you know, as you said, you make them kind of feel special and, you know, that they found something or experienced something that other players haven't. And I think that's very kind of important for players. But again, I think, as Sean was saying, the fast feedback loop is very important. And just trying to stuff as much as you can in there. You know, we had a load of ambient dialogue in the Overlord games and, you know, huge pools of it. So, you know, we had the problem that players would hear stuff again, but I just write as much as possible. So there was they were very variable. But writing for those little moments, like when, you know, the player dies or they keep being stupid, is always a lot of fun. And I think there's a lot that games can do to kind of embrace that. Certainly in Dark Legend, we had the way that Noel addressed the players when they loaded up the game that directly related to how long it had been since they'd last played, so if it had been a day or kind of a few days. And so it kind of goes from being very kind of sycophantic to being a bit standoffish, being sort of sarcastic and then very, very depressed. And that was just a kind of nice little thing that we kind of thought, oh, yeah, players would like that. And it, you know.
Brianna, you talked to me earlier about Alice and Kev. I don't know if you guys have seen this, but this student in the UK created a Sims 3 family, a mother or a father and a daughter who were homeless. They basically lived on two park benches, and then
just a father and a daughter. There was a mother involved.
No, yes, I misspoke.
Oh.
I apologize, Brianna.
It's important. It's important.
It's just a father and daughter. This is what she was like yesterday too. I'm sorry you have to see this. But you know, and then she just sort of watches them go, and it's, you know, it tells a very poignant and occasionally very funny story. I'm wondering if you guys can talk about, you know, maybe this is just, you know, an ineffable magic, but is it possible to sort of create a game consciously where this sort of emergent humor can come out, where, you know, the player can express themselves and create some comedy that the developers didn't even foresee?
I mean, I think The Sims as a whole franchise is indicative of that. And it can be very subjective humour as well. I mean, my personal experience with The Sims was playing a Sims Pets expansion pack, and that's when the little cats and puppies, they actually come and watch you as you take a shower. And I found that funny because my cats do the same thing. And I think it's because they think that I'll slip over and they can eat my feet or something like that. But it was just seeing life kind of mirrored in the virtual world was a lot of fun. And Alice and Kev is great, and I think it works because it's such a horrible, heart-wrenching premise. I mean, this father and daughter are homeless, and they have the same needs as every other Sim. So they need to eat and sleep. And kind of make friends. And the lady that created them had given them some traits that really kind of knocked up against those. So, for example, Alice was very clumsy, so she'd be desperate to try and make friends, so she could like find somewhere to sleep that wasn't a park bench, and she'd go in and to a neighbour's house, and they'd be okay for a while, and then she'd break the microwave, and then there'd be an argument, and she wouldn't get anywhere to sleep, and she'd just fall asleep on a doorstep and things like that. And it was
That's
kind of
hilarious.
That is funny.
And it was kind of sad, but sort of funny at the same time. And I think that's
When you think about it, it's
Yeah.
pretty funny.
Yeah.
When you think about it.
maybe it
Like
was,
Sixth
just,
and Market is just hilarious. We can just walk down there now.
but I think that's one of the reasons that comedy can be important. And I think Psychonauts is a great example of where comedy can lower your defenses, and then it hits you with a kind of 1-2 punch of something more emotional. And that's why Psychonauts is one of my favourite games for that reason. The comedy lowers your defences, and then it kind of hits you with the kind of emotional stuff. Was that deliberate?
Out of cruelty.
But yeah. I think so.
I mean, that gets back to the earlier question, I guess, about inspirations, because I really like, in high school I read all of Kurt Vonnegut's books, and I really like that, just that tone of like, he wasn't saying like, I'm going to be funny constantly or I'm going to be really sad constantly. It was just like all mixed together as he was talking about life, because that's the way life is. Like, all of our lives are touched by tragedy and funny things every day, and I just think that's interesting to do in writing, and just if you're gonna just throw that stuff in there, I think it's most interesting when it's all mixed together like that.
Yeah, like you need something of consequence, and clearly, like, it's Allison. What is the name of it again? Kev. Like, that's clearly of consequence. I mean, and that's where the jokes come from, So yeah, you need that, and I think Psychonauts does a really great job of that, actually. Like, with this story of Raz.
People are going to think I put this panel together.
That's fine.
You guys
all right.
You're just, yeah.
Well, I mean, there was the payment before, but what were you talking about? Emerging comedy. I'm not going to tell this story then.
Tell it.
No, because it's about Brutal Legend. Like, a buddy was telling me, like, I think what's nice is their game where, like, it's, again, in a Telltale game, a lot of the stuff, like, there's a lot of things that are scripted, and we don't have so much of the, like, there aren't crazy physics going on, so things aren't going to fall funny, and there's not ragdoll and that sort of thing. It's more of this character interactions where the humor is found. But like, I had a friend who his favorite moment of Brutal Legend was somehow his hot rod got backed up onto the face of one of those big dudes.
It's just going to be a bug.
No, he peeled out on the guy's face. And he thought that was he's like, this is the best game ever. I've peeled out on somebody's face. So,
totally planned that.
yes. Your face peel out tech.
That's, I am going to misquote someone smarter than me was talking about AI, and we're talking about whether it's important to have really, really complicated AI or just a random number generator that fools people. And they were like, well, and one of the most, it's probably from one of the talks at GDC, but it was like, one of the most important things is not how smart the AI is, but how much the characters in the game seem to recognize what's happening. So, like, it wasn't their AI that made them get behind the car and get their face peeled out on, but if they can detect it's happening and say something, acknowledge, it seems like the game thought that whole thing through, and like, whoa, but it was really just, kind of just reacting to what happens in the world. But not that we were that good. I don't think we anticipated the test of the face and then, my face, that would have been a funny thing to do right there.
Classic.
Which that is a line that we've used in the game, and that's another lesson. If there's only one lesson that I teach anyone ever, it's that things that are funny, don't use them as taunts in a boss fight. That's all I'm going to say. Nothing is funny 30 times in a row. I wish I could remember that lesson, but I do it all the time.
Well, but that sort of gets to my next question, which is, like, how do you pick your moments? We're talking about sort of games that are infused with comedy throughout, but, in a game that necessarily, isn't a comedy game, where do you pick your moments to sort of let it be a little more light?
Certainly with Overlord, it's pretty much everywhere in the... I guess because there's so much players can kind of miss, that there was just the attempt to kind of stuff it in wherever possible, but keep it layered as well. So, it was the kind of animation and just general gameplay. I mean, there was a little bit of what I think players interpreted as emergent, all the hats on, the seal hats and the pumpkin heads and all sorts of things. That felt emergent because there was a certain amount of player involvement in that, and then they had to kind of destroy the pumpkins or kill the baby seals to get the baby seal hat, and so it kind of felt emergent. There's a lot of baby seal killing in Overlord too, I have to warn you, but it's great.
Homeless baby seals.
Yeah.
They fall asleep on your doorstep and then you take their heads. The animation, the general gameplay, and then the script, and then the voice acting, and then just putting it in as many places as possible, really, which sounds kind of random, but I think that's all you can kind of do in a game is just try and pour it in, and I don't think you can ever be too funny. So the way the players play and what their experience, whether it's an hour or kind of 40, there'll always be something in it, and just the kind of just throwing out lots of seeds and hoping that some fall on fertile ground is kind of my approach, which isn't very kind of structured or planned, but...
It's hard to say how to achieve it. I always think of it as like, who do you want to go to lunch with? Like the guy who's like, I'm going to be funny all the time. Oh my God, the salt and pepper shaker's hilarious. And they're just on all the time. Or just, there's some people who you don't even think of them as funny people, and then you're just sitting there and they say that one quiet thing that everyone on the table just drops because it's the funniest thing you've ever heard. And it's like, you really aspire to that, to just be that game that just they're not expecting it, and then you just do something hilarious. And how do you do that? Oh man, you should go see a panel on that or something to learn how to do that. That'd be useful.
I have no insight into that, no. But like for us, I mean, a lot of it is where do we pick our drama, because the drama is going to kind of prop up the comedy. And again, kind of creating that consequence. So that's the important part, for me at least. And then the jokes will come, but like, again, you don't want to, that's a really good example. You don't want to be that guy who's like, I'm funny, I'm a wacky dude. Like, we really don't want to be that guy. You don't want your game to be that guy. So.
Thank you both for disagreeing with me so wholeheartedly on that. But
Well, no, I'm just saying, like, you can be funny all the time. You can be funny all the time, but it's that knowing the game knowing it's funny is the hard part. And I think drama, if you sprinkle it in, will take the edges off of that.
And I think also in games that it should be much more than just about dialogue, and that's why I think certainly with all our games, that's why it kind of works. In that there was sort of kind of amusing things going on a lot of the time, but a lot of them were very subtle, so it wasn't always language. Sometimes there's a little bit of animation in the corner, or sometimes it was a visual. And so it wasn't just a case of keeping it all dialogue and it had to be funny, funny, funny all the time. But there was just humour sprinkled liberally throughout, and depending on how the players played and how observational they were, they'd get kind of less or more of it.
Tim, you started out with, writing games that were heavy on text, and now we're sort of into like this voice acting era on the AAA games. Does your writing style change when the reader is sort of going to be inserting their own, or the player is going to be inserting their own voice into the text between when you have, an actor reading the lines?
I mean, do you write differently for text games and voiced games?
Yeah.
It's definitely totally, I mean, it's, just having that, yes. It's like, it's, writing for an actor it's really different, but sometimes you fix it in the studio. Like, I'm lucky enough to be there, and some of us are, if you're in the studio, you're like, oh, that's really clunks when you read that way. And, a good actor and a good voice director will be able to make good changes along the way. But yeah, just trying to read you kind of hear it in your voice, in your head, and learning to like write stuff that, there's a lot of stuff that isn't awkward when you read it on the page, but when you hear it read, it's just a run-on sentence like this one that I'm doing right now. And it just like, that's a whole part of the process, is writing stuff that will sound good when it's read out loud. But you make mistakes, and you hopefully fix it along the way. And sometimes you're editing voice files, trying to fix it, or like, oh, we'll fix it with the animation, or oh, we'll cover it with particles. But
It's like F-16s fly over, just like, and then the lips move. And
just put a crash bug right there, no one will notice. Oh, you thought those were accidents?
Do you guys do like table reads and things like that before you get into the studio?
We scratch dialogue recordings. Like the team, most of the programmers and people in the office do the voice the first pass through a lot of the times, and hearing it makes you change it. But mostly, like sometimes I do speak quietly to myself at my desk while I'm typing.
I definitely read everything over and over out loud, or at least like mumble it to myself, so I look schizophrenic. But we do table reads at Telltale, and the table reads we've just kind of started doing it because we don't really have that. From a scheduling standpoint, it's weird for us to do scratch track and how to get that in on just the way we make the game. So we do table reads. That really helps a lot, totally. And also the writer is generally the lead designer, the director. I mean, we kind of if you wrote the game, you're generally one of those people. So, like, I sit in the studio as well, and it's like that's, you'll work out a few things there. You don't want to be rewriting every line in the studio, obviously. But you can, and we do the exact same thing, like chopping up lines, cutting stuff off, just like, oh man, there needs to be a beat in here, and figuring out how to split voice files and stuff like that. So all along the way, you're trying to make it, funny, and in the nuance of the funny.
Rhianna, you're, I feel like a freelance comedy video game writer is a pretty rare bird. Is there sort of a path into that, and how did you get started in that?
It's kind of accidental, really, in that I was recommended to Codemasters for this kind of fantasy game. I didn't really know too much about it, and I thought I'd give it a go. And there seemed like there were maybe funny premises that I could work with, and they clearly wanted something that was a certain type of funny that even they weren't sure of, but they'd know when someone got it. And apparently I did, and so that was kind of nice. And here I am, kind of 4.5 games later. it's difficult to define any path into games writing because some of it can just be so sort of random, and the best thing to do is just put yourself out there or come up with example texts of the style you write. And I think it takes a while to develop a voice in games writing because usually everything you do will be so different. I've always been approached about games that are completely different to anything I've ever done, and I just don't kind of understand why people look at what I've done and think, oh yeah, that's the person from this kind of racing game or first-person shooter or whatever. But I think that's one of the challenges of being a games writer is being able to take your voice and squish it around into a different medium. I can't really think of a path for a specific kind of comedy game writing trying to get into games, but more comedy premises, I think. Thinking about, from the get-go, from the actual mechanics. If you can get more developers and publishers thinking about that, then you're going to get more kind of comedy writers coming into games and doing good stuff.
Tim and Sean, do you start with that premise before you even think about the gameplay mechanics? What's sort of the order of things for you, of your creative process?
You want to go first? I mean, our games are all, the mechanics are also, we evolve, and I think we're in a very, just from a company standpoint, I think Telltale, we're starting to evolve. It's a very high evolution time for us in figuring out how to do sort of where we came from with sort of a Scum background into what is a Telltale adventure game into what is a Telltale game. So mechanics we're adding and evolving, but we do people know what to expect. So, I think it's probably more of it's a better question for Tim, I guess, because the mechanics seem to change from Psychonauts to Brutal Legend. Obviously there's third-person exploration, but there's more detail into that thing.
I guess for me, I start with just different every time. Sometimes it's like a world I think about that I'd love to go into. And Ron Gilbert will tell that story about a Monkey Island that he was on the ride of Pirates of the Caribbean, and he wanted to jump off the ride and explore that world. So sometimes it's a world exploration desire, and then you think about, well, who should the main character be? Who would the coolest person in that world be? It's a leader of the biker gang, or the Grim Reaper, and then thinking about the abilities that character would be interesting for them to have. Sometimes just the world leads to gameplay mechanics, and sometimes you start with gameplay mechanics. So it's really different every time, but that's kind of the answer.
I want to get to questions before we run out of time. But before we do that, I just wanted to sort of, do you have any closing thoughts? Because I'm sure you've seen at GDC, so many of the developers are, they're really smart and they're very funny, and you don't always see that show up in the games. What advice would you give to a developer who sort of has this natural wit for translating that into the game world? Or maybe you don't have any advice at all and you don't want any competition.
No, I think, the best thing you can do is, empower your people to be funny. And realize that, everything from the tool set to the pipeline to just trusting a joke that looks funny on paper and funny, I mean odd. Looks odd on paper and, but somebody believes in it. That's really good because I do think the process, because making games is this massive collaboration where if you don't have kind of a strong vision, you don't have that strong comedic thrust, it's gonna fall off. It's gonna slough off very fast. It's kind of like the system of making a game is almost like a rock tumbler, and the jokes are the hard edges. And you kind of want to just go, empower people to make bold choices and make specific choices, because that's where the funny stuff is going to come from. Because over time, that stuff will, you work 3 years on a game and you had a joke the second week. It's hard to keep that alive. It's hard to do CPR on a joke for 2.5 years. So you have to find ways to do that culturally, I think.
And if you're on the other end of it, if you're not that powerful at the company, sometimes you just be really sneaky.
Oh yeah, that's really good too.
I don't think.
Sure.
I don't want to speak for Eric Wolpa or Kim Swift, but I don't think when Portal started, I don't think they're we're going to make this comedy game, and they thought of this and we'll have this mechanic with the portals later. I think it was it was all about a gameplay mechanic, and I think while they're developing it, they kind of it kind of emerged, the comedy kind of emerged as they're writing it. Maybe I'm totally wrong on that angle, but and it came, one of my favorite things about it. We want 10 minutes. Okay, sorry. I get to talk for 10 minutes, I think is what she's saying. So it's kind of like I'm saying, every company is different and everyone's in a different position of power or no power. And it's like sometimes it's just guerrilla style. Like you can take advantage of that lack of vision on your project to be like, well, no one really has a vision for the writing, so I'm just going to make this really funny. Or, and just hope no one cancels the project before we're done.
I think a lot of it is about trusting writers, and there isn't enough trust for writers whether they're being funny or not in the games industry, and I think that's probably something that has to change. Like I said, I was lucky with the Overlord team, and it was a small team, and they just trusted me because I was the kind of native English speaker, and the comedy emerged in it, and I don't think it was necessarily completely planned to the extent that it came out from the start. But I think that's sometimes the best way. I mean, it started with a good premise, and then it just sort of grew from there. I think it is finding those light-hearted premises that can kind of hold up, fun dialogue or great, fun level design or mechanics or whatever. I think it really needs to be more than just dialogue. And unfortunately, writers are coming in quite late. That there's there may be some funny lines, but that's kind of all it is. And comedy is very subjective. And I've had situations where people have been removing funny lines because they've sort of said, oh, it's a serious situation. I said, yes, that's where you kind of need to sort of offset it, and it says something about that particular character. And again, I'd say writer trust. That's where it builds from. If we can get more of that, then hopefully good writing, good comedy writing will come through much more on a broader scale.
And everyone on the team, right, has the opportunity to sneak comedy into the game. And it's often, Monkey Island, Steve Purcell was the one who was like coming in as an artist, just putting in really funny jokes or animation that were not in the plan. We didn't, ask for it, and couldn't stop him, and so it snuck in that way. The art. I mean, one of the funniest things that happened in the game, well, like in Castle Crashers, when that deer is scared shitless. Like I have really lowbrow sensibilities, but I laughed so hard at that. I thought it was the funniest thing I've ever seen. And it was all, of course, based on great writing. The deer that shit itself. I'm kidding. That was not. So, and writers and even like sound designers have great opportunities for sneaking, comedy, and programmers, and the gameplay programmers especially can just add these twists as they implement stuff. And there's just all these little places to sneak stuff in. I mean, there's funny moments in every game now. It seems that there are these little moments in even the most serious games where there are funny things going on. And one of my favorite things about like Uncharted, just to make sure that it's mentioned in every talk, we'll just make sure we mention Uncharted. My favorite things about that game are just the little moments of dialogue that they'll say as they just as you're playing, he'll just hear him mumbling to himself, and once in a while he'll be like, well, they're inspired. They're great. And so, yeah.
Well, on that note, let's take some questions. Yeah. There's a microphone right in the middle. I guess a bunch of you have found it. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi. You said you didn't want to be the person who just kept throwing joke after joke out there. Do you have any suggestions for a new personality about that? Because generally they go, no, just kidding. But anyway, seriously, do you think that maybe the comedy genre will get out there if there are more, I guess, adaptations of movies or TV shows? The Simpsons had a game, but I know I for one would love to play, Hangover the game, something like that. I think that would be a really great idea. And do you see that happening in the future?
So the question is whether the comedy genre in games will take hold if there's more adaptations of funny properties from other media.
Well, I don't think the game industry can be blamed for not adapting enough movies, but I mean, we do a lot of licensed product at Telltale, obviously. I mean, again,
if it's done really, really well and it's a big, huge hit, but you were gonna, I mean, I'm still the one who believes there should be a genre called comedy in games. I mean, I think that's possible to have, and it's one of the big genres in movies, and so I think it's a way for the games industry to reach different people than they reach with summer blockbuster movies, which is what a lot of games are. There's a whole untapped audience of people who really just like comedies that would play those games if you would figure out a way to make that bridge between them and us.
Yeah.
Us and them.
Go ahead.
Satire and parody are important elements of comedy, but it seems often that publishers are wary of going that route because of IP issues. Have you ever experienced this resistance, and do you think we should fight to have more parody and satire in games?
I'm sorry, could you...
Because of IP issues, did you say?
Well, yes, yeah, if you do a parody of some other IP or whatever, I mean, it's protected by the First Amendment for things like movies.
Parody is definitely protected. I mean, I've never had anyone tell us not to put something in the game based on parody, unless we unless we sung a specific song that was covered by a copyright or something like that, which happened a couple times. But mostly, no one's been like, "Oh, don't make fun of them," because that is covered,
I'm really bad at parody, so I don't know how to answer the question. I'm terrible at it.
Go ahead.
Hi. It strikes me that games are generally consumed much more like books and TV than they are movies, and yet I think this is the only game writing session I've had all week which didn't heavily draw on movies rather than those other two. Do you think that you guys are more inspired by books and TV specifically because you're in comedy, or do you just think the whole industry is a bit too in love with Star Wars?
So the question is, A, why weren't there more brilliant game writing sessions like this one?
And it's probably, I know why, because you guys didn't fill out your form. So we just take this form and circle all the 5s down here.
5 straight down.
Because I know you don't want to do a test, but we have the answer key up here, and the answer is 5
answer.
to every question. Just circle it with one, because then there'll be, oh my God, the highest scoring session in the whole thing was a comedy writing session. Let's have 5 comedy writing sessions next time.
So you can make a difference. And we've got a heckler in the front rows just the whole time. And the actual question was, are you more inspired by books and television than by other media?
As a company, we're very inspired by TV because we're episodic. And, Tales of Monkey Island's a comedy game, but, in the first few meetings, people were talking about Lost because there's this nice hook month to month, and that was a big challenge for the company at the time. It's month to month we want to keep people engaged, so TV is a very big inspiration for the company as a whole, and for me. It's hard for me to stick with shows over the long, moment to moment, but it is a big inspiration, and I think that's why Telltale has been successful, because we're kind of blazing our own path by looking at what TV does. The fact that we have a writer's room is from TV, so.
Yeah, I think TV writing is probably more applicable to games than movie writing. Certainly looking at the way characters are kind of constructed and scenes are turned in very small spaces. I think I've kind of learned more about how to adapt that from games from looking at the TV model than from film. I'd say... books to a certain degree, although I think good writers just are sponges and they just absorb it from anywhere. But of all the other mediums, I'd definitely say that TV and a mixture of theatre can really work well for games sometimes.
Hi, so I'm an AI guy, and I used to work at Lionhead, and I led the Village AI team on the original Fable, where we did a lot of one-line quip kind of writing. I worked with a great guy there, James Leach, who wrote a lot of stuff, but also we were able to get the voice actors to improvise in sessions and so on, and some of that worked well, but one of the frustrations I had with that was the lack of any long-term structure, because it was all one-line quips. Some of it was funny, but we never told any jokes with long-term structure. Which is, I guess, easier to do in an adventure game where you're more certain of what's going to happen. So I just wondered what your thoughts were on telling jokes that have a long-term structure in open world games, maybe, or how difficult that is.
So the question is, what's the place for long-term jokes that sort of have a voice over the entirety of the game and one-line quips, as he put it?
I think it has to be very well planned, because certainly you don't know what the player's experience. You don't always know what the player has experienced at kind of any one time, or whether they've gone to this corner or that, and so it has to be sort of done along the spine of the game. I'd love to see more of that. And I know what you mean about the kind of one-line quips, because there's certainly a lot of that in the ambient dialogue of the Overlord games as well. You can have a lot of fun with it, and certainly it's much more contextual based, and we had the people, it's all reaction to what the player was doing. So whether they were setting fire to a house or another person, or whether their minions were getting drunk and weeing everywhere, or stuff like that. So it's very contextual. But I love to see stuff that goes over the entirety of a game. But again, it would have to be kind of planned and held on to quite strongly, which doesn't sound much fun, but I think that's probably the only way it's going to work.
I definitely think about the game as a whole, and we put these running jokes in them often. I don't know if a running joke is the kind of structure you're talking about or something more sophisticated. But a lot of the times it's like something happens at the end of the game, and then I'll often be writing the intro to the game last, and so I'll write the intro as if I was brilliantly foreshadowing all the stuff that happened, but it just was stuff that emerged later in the game. I'm gonna make it look like I planned this whole thing right now. But a lot of it is just accidents.
Well, we have to vacate the... One more?
One more.
I'm sorry, man. We got to get out of here, but because just want to take a quick second to thank Rhianna, Tim, and Sean for coming.
Thanks for coming.
And thanks to all of you. Fill out your forms and give them to the green-shirted volunteers on your way out. Thanks a lot.